This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
Howdy, folks. This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to my very good friend Cristina Gomez on Shifting the Paradigm.
This is Ray Sobbs from the UnchartedX Network, and you're listening to Shifting the Paradigm with the intrepid Cristina Gomez on the X.
You're listening to the UnchartedX Network, KUNX-DB, Kansas City, Missouri.
Welcome to Shifting the Paradigm. I'm Cristina Gomez on the Paradigm Shifts channel and on the X, the new mainstream KUNX digital broadcasting talk radio. Are you ready for this? Because we're about to embark on an hour and a half of UFO shenanigans and paranormal adventures. Right here is where we look and think outside the proverbial box. We jump down those rabbit holes, or you get a red Tic Tac instead of a red pill. First off, make sure you subscribe and share these shows on social media to those who you think are having their minds and eyes open to the reality of the UFO mystery. All of these shows are great primers, and in the push for more clarity, transparency, and disclosure, the more voices demanding answers, the better. For those listening on KUNX Talk Radio and affiliates, I have two other shows each week that only air on my YouTube channel. Mysteries with a History is live on Thursdays at 2:30 p.m. PST with my co-host, Jimmy Church of Fade to Black Radio, and each week we cover a different topic in depth. On Fridays at 3 p.m. PST, the live show Strange Paradigms is where I cover all the strange weekly news and mysterious headlines from around the world. So definitely check out my website at strangeparadigms.com for all show archives, more information, and direct video links to my channel. Oh, and make sure to hit the notification bell on YouTube. Here is some news of the day. A rocket crashed back to Earth shortly after liftoff Monday in the first launch accident for Jeff Bezos' space travel company, but the capsule-carrying experiments managed to parachute to safety. No one was on board the Blue Origin flight, which used the same kind of rocket as the one that sends paying customers to the edge of space. The Federal Aviation Administration said that the rockets are now grounded pending the outcome of an investigation. Kent, Washington-based company, tweeted close to an hour after the rocket failed, stating, "Booster failure on today's uncrewed flight. Escape system performed as designed." The mishap occurred as the rocket was traveling nearly 700 miles per hour at an altitude of about 28,000 feet. There was no video shown of the rocket, only the capsule after the failure. It happened around the point when the rocket was under the maximum amount of pressure called Max Q. It was the 23rd flight for the New Shepard program, named after the first American in space, Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard. It was the 9th flight for this particular rocket capsule pair, which was dedicated to flying experiments. Interestingly, the rocket should have launched nearly 2 weeks ago, but was grounded until Monday by bad weather. In other news, the internet was asked to name a probe for Uranus, given the potential puns that are inevitably attached to Uranus. This is dangerous territory. Surprisingly, however, the butt jokes appear to be in the minority, with many respondents taking the question in good faith and answering accordingly. A mission to Uranus is not currently in development, but nor is it entirely a pipe dream. Missions have been sent to most planets in the solar system, such as Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, having all been visited and surveyed by dedicated probes. Even Jupiter's moons are getting a mission as well. The ice giants, on the other hand, have been somewhat neglected. Earlier this year, this led a panel of experts from the U.S. National Academies to recommend a mission to Uranus in its decadal report to NASA. In fact, the panel classified Uranus top priority. Uranus is one of the most intriguing bodies in the solar system, the scientists wrote. Its low internal energy, active atmospheric dynamics, and complex magnetic field all present major puzzles. A primordial giant impact may have produced the planet's extreme axial tilt and possibly its rings and satellites, although this is uncertain. Uranus's large ice rock moons displayed surprising evidence of geological activity in limited Voyager 2 flyby data and are potential ocean worlds. Some names for this probe include Salius, the ancient Roman counterpart to Greek god Uranus, or Odin, the Norse god who defeated the ice giants of myth. What seems to be the most popular suggestion, however, is Tempest. This is because a number of Uranus' 27 moons are named after Shakespeare characters, with the greatest proportion, 9 or 10 if you count Ariel, from the Tempest. So, whatever the name, the mission would reveal more information about one of the most enigmatic worlds in the solar system. Now, if you could name this probe, with jokes aside, what would you consider naming it? I personally really like the name Odin, mainly because I'm a sucker for the stories in Norse mythology. Odin only has one eye, as he sacrificed it in order to see everything that happens in the world. That's a pretty hardcore story, and I think it's worthy to have a probe named after it. With the news out of the way, let me talk about my guest. Ben Van Kerkwyk is an Australian researcher, writer, and content creator now living in the United States. He produces the UnchartedX.com website and UnchartedX YouTube channel and podcast, producing long form documentaries on various topics dealing with ancient mysteries and the new scientific work that should have a bearing on the story of human history and civilization. A lifelong student and fan of history, Ben has been traveling the world for decades, visiting places like Egypt and South America regularly, and has researched and filmed at many ancient sites, as well as interviewing and interacting with many of the leading researchers and authors working in the field, like Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, George Howard, and more. Welcome to Shifting the Paradigm, Ben. Thank you for being here. How's it going?
Pretty good, Christina. Thank you so much for the invite. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, for those who aren't familiar with you or your work, could you please tell us about yourself and what you do?
It's a little odd story, I guess, but I run. My name's Ben Van Kerkwyk. I run the UnchartedX YouTube channel, website, everything else. I'm kind of a one-man band that's ended up on YouTube, I guess. But my background was in information technology, IT. So I spent a good 20 years working in the networking field. Kind of ended up in the CTO space for Hewlett Packard, and yeah, my background is really looking at a lot of the evolution and integration of technologies. I always had a deep interest in ancient history and in Egypt. I was introduced to Graham Hancock many years ago. I had the chance to travel with him throughout Peru and Bolivia. And if people don't know who Graham Hancock is, he's probably one of the better known people in the I guess the so-called alternative space for ancient history. But he wrote a very well-known book called Fingerprints of the Gods that really, ignited a lot of interest around the world in this possibility that our timelines on this planet in terms of human civilizations are a bit longer. And that certainly happened to me. And once I got the chance to meet Graham and travel with him through it was Peru and Bolivia in 2013, and then through Egypt for the first time in 2015, I was just kind of entirely fascinated and sucked into this whole world of looking at sort of some alternative explanations for some of the evidence that we can still see on these ancient sites. And a lot of this evidence lends itself to the idea that in fact we've kind of had longer timelines. And the more I've gotten into this and researching it over the years, the more I've come to learn that, yeah, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that's come up, particularly in the last sort of recent 2 or 3 decades, that a lot of it comes from these adjacent fields of history, things that aren't, directly coming from archaeological finds and things like that, but more like, paleoclimatology, the study of the catastrophic climate events that have happened in the past, genetics, the extension of the human timeline, some of the engineering studies in particular into some of the stonework and the architectures and monuments. So that has just fascinated me, and it kind of coincided with the rise of modern technology, like consumer grade technology that you could now take a 4K camera that's, stabilized with a gimbal system and actually take a good look at a lot of these sites. And I thought that, and look at them within the context of some of these new ideas. And I hadn't seen that there'd been much of that type of thing going on. So I thought, there's a space for some work here that we could get into this kind of topic and take a fresh look at a lot of these sites. So that's kind of where I went. And naturally, when you're getting started in this thing, I didn't know the first thing about making documentaries or anything, but you kind of end up on YouTube. And so I over the process of a few years, I guess I kind of built an audience, and it became my full-time job to really go and do all this travel, document all of these sites, do a lot of research. And mostly what I produce now are kind of, I'd call them full lengths of 45 minutes to an hour kind of documentaries looking at various topics that deal with all of these topics. So the evidence for lost ancient technology, a lot of the evidence for some of the true age of some of these sites, and things like that really take an alternative look at some of the mainstream paradigms of history. We've kind of always had this single version of history, right? In terms of human civilizations, like this is our picture of the past hasn't changed for more than 100 years, really. Like, we know that humans, evolved from our ancestors at some point in the past, spent several 100,000 years as essentially hunter-gatherers in a Stone Age technology phase, if you like. And then only some 6,000 years ago, you have the emergence of civilization, complex political and social groups, the rise in populations, towns and cities, specialization in occupation, organized agriculture, all these types of things. And that kind of all emerged around 6,000 years ago in the great cultures that we know of, like Sumeria and Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, then followed on by Greeks, Romans, Chinese, and many others. But that picture hasn't changed much in 100 plus years. But in recent decades, as I said, there's been a lot of evidence that's come from particularly adjacent fields of science, but also from within archaeology itself, that really challenge that paradigm. They really should be forcing a change in our perspective on the origins of human civilization in particular. And there's one thing in that really plays into this in a really big way, which is the discovery of cataclysm. So that we know that there was a period of time called the Younger Dryas that was basically the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, which is the era that we're in today, that occurred roughly around 13,000 years ago. And since 2007, there's been something like 150 different peer-reviewed papers looking at the scientific evidence for this. And so essentially what those papers and all of this work from groups like the Comet Research Group indicates is that there was a colossal cosmic impact, or a series of them, that hit the Earth only 13,000 years ago. That this was the driver for the melting of the glaciers. This was a major factor in the sort of sudden extinction of a lot of megafauna that happened, particularly across North America, South America, and Europe. I mean, I'm talking about things like woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, the short-faced bear, dire wolves. There was a tremendous number of megafauna that went extinct in a very short period of time. And this also drove, catastrophic rises in sea level up to approximately the level that they're at today. And there's now tremendous evidence supporting this. It's interesting, though, is that story of cataclysm is also contained within every ancient and even modern religions and myths and origin stories. Like you can't look at any particular ancient culture, ours included, like the Abrahamic religions, we tell a story about the Great Flood, and if you go and look at all of the other cultures and ancient cultures, modern cultures, a lot of them contain that same sort of story, of origin story, be it flood or fire, and the fact that their ancestors, who were essentially civilized, it may have even been their gods, but they were essentially wiped out and forced to start again. And now we have kind of genetic evidence within the human race itself that supports this. There was a tremendous bottleneck in human populations that occurred around that 13,000 year period. So it really lends itself to this interesting picture of the past, that Cataclysm played a massive role in this, and it's new evidence for Cataclysm. So if there's another way to interpret kind of the earliest parts of human civilization, in that instead of just coming out of the Stone Age and building everything that we see in places like ancient Egypt, or the megalithic remains in South America and Peru, instead some of that stuff may be much older, and the cultures that we know emerged having inherited some of those things, essentially being bootstrapped through them, and then they continued over thousands of years to work on those sites, to modify them, to renovate them, to reuse them, to build their own cultures in that image. So yeah, that's essentially the big top tent pole kind of overview of the stuff that I look into and that I get into in some detail on my channel.
And you sound incredibly passionate about it. You can just hear it in your voice and the way you express it. So, being interested in history and traveling the world, reading books, and speaking to others that are knowledgeable in ancient civilizations, in your opinion, do you think that museums give the history of humanity an accurate coverage, or do you feel there's a bias to ignore certain discoveries and indicators of an alternative history?
It's a good question, and I wouldn't necessarily single out museums specifically. There is certainly I would call an entrenched dogma within the academic disciplines of things like archaeology and Egyptology, and that extends itself to museums, because typically the people that run museums and curate them come from those fields. So this is it's a battle that has been fought multiple times. Anyone who is familiar with Graham Hancock's work, perhaps people who watched the Joe Rogan Experience, have seen him on there a number of times. There's one episode in particular where Graham was joined by Michael Shermer, as a classical kind of skeptic, as well as Randall Carlson, another good friend of mine, who was put this debate to some light. There's definitely a reluctance to engage with, I think, some of this new evidence that's in the academic mainstream when it comes to archaeology and Egyptology, and I think that happens for a number of reasons. One is that it's kind of interesting that archaeology and this idea of particularly looking at the very earliest parts of human history. It's not really a hard science, as you might think of physics or chemistry as a hard science, right? You have hypothesis, experiment, result. You can't really say the same thing about archaeology or Egyptology. It's much more of a softer science, something related more to like language studies and human studies. Mostly the job of an archaeologist or an Egyptologist is to analyze kind of the daily life of that civilization, look at how they lived, and to piece together all these very disparate pieces of evidence to build a picture of the past. So it's the people that I think that become the experts in this field, the people that are lecturing in universities, that have tenure, that basically have their profession and their self-worth is very much tied up in this interpretation of history. And ultimately all it is, it's a story. It's an interpretation of what is ultimately very scant evidence. But their sense of authority, I think, and their sense of sort of personal power even derives from their position as an expert in that story. And in some ways, this is quite similar to religion, right? As much as a priest or the organizational structure of, say, the Catholic Church, it derives from their positions as experts in this particular story, this tale. So when new evidence comes along that fundamentally threatens the very foundation of that story, that says, well, actually, our whole picture of the past may be wrong, it can be viewed as somewhat threatening. So there's really been a lack of real debate and actual engagement from those academic fields to deal with a lot of this new evidence. And so a great example is something I mentioned earlier, which is the Younger Dryas Cataclysm that happened, despite there being more than overwhelming scientific evidence now, 150 plus peer-reviewed papers. If people are interested, they can find all of those papers documented on thecosmictusk.com George Howard runs that website. He's a good friend of mine. But if you go and look at sort of the authoritative mainstream sources for Younger Dryas, things like Wikipedia, for example, they just don't even engage with any of that evidence. It's just on Wikipedia, the entry for Younger Dryas basically dismisses this as recycled Donnelly comet myths from the 1600s and earlier periods, and without ever engaging with it. And that happens because the guy who's writing that webpage is a professor of archaeology, and he doesn't like the idea of the Younger Dryas kind of threatening this story of the past. But it's a little unfortunate. And when it comes to museums, it's a bit of a block, because in my opinion, there are a number of investigative approaches that we could take, particularly with a lot of the artifacts that we have, things like tube drills and the very precise, we can talk about this later, the precision stone jars and some of these stone artifacts that are in these museums. This also applies to stuff that's on the sites. So there's really no willingness to let alternative approaches or even any real investigative approach take place with these when it comes to these artifacts. Things like really deep and high resolution 3D scanning. Let's define the degree of precision. Let's really investigate the tool marks that we can see on these statues and on these jars and things like this. There have been one or two museums around the world, in particular the Petrie Museum, the Flinders Petrie Museum in London, who have allowed some of that research to happen. And in fact, that's really one of the only cases where we've actually been able to take significant steps forward in terms of analyzing some of these artifacts. And it's led to entire new disciplines of thought and approaches to reinterpreting the past based on the evidence that we've got from actual modern investigations into some of these artifacts. I don't want to say all this and sort of disparage archaeology or Egyptology, because I do think that it's a saying. It's like Planck's constant. It's right. Science advances one funeral at a time. This doesn't just apply to archaeology, but it applies to many fields of science. And I remain very hopeful that this is a picture that is slowly changing. More and more people are interested in this. And I can tell you, I've been contacted by a lot of students that are going through university at the moment, undergrads in archaeology or Egyptology, who are much more willing to engage with a lot of this alternative evidence, as it has been brought forth by many authors and many researchers over the last 20 or 30 years. So I do think that over time, there is going to be more engagement. And I think the evidence certainly warrants a rewriting of those very earliest parts of human history. We do have a good picture of what happened after that period. So once you get to the time when it's Greeks and Romans and Egyptians and all of those sort of civilizations living concurrently, we can correlate different sources for events and people, and so we do have a good picture of what happened after that period, so right up to the current day. But the real mystery, I think, it lies in what happened before that. What was the genesis of human civilization, and have we been, a global advanced civilization in the past at some point? One that was perhaps wiped out by cataclysm, and one that was generated the seed for so many of these cultures to then later emerge, a few thousand years after we all recovered from this tremendous impact and really rough time that the planet went through around 13,000 years ago.
It just goes to show that our thinking is definitely changing with the concept of history. And like you had mentioned, people in university are contacting you. They're more open-minded to this. And I'm in university and I've attempted to go ahead and test or question my professors, and they're totally against it. And it's incredibly unfortunate that when people talk about history or science or even math or really any subject, they bring their opinion, their bias, and their ego with them. And if you question them, it's like you're bruising their entire persona, their entire ego. And
Exactly.
But when it comes to you and those that you have followed, you're looking at the facts. You're looking at the things that just don't necessarily make sense, where archaeologists, in some respects, not all, but in some respects, are kind of avoiding. And a lot of enthusiasts that look into ancient civilizations are inclined to think that the alternative to the mainstream view of history has been deliberately avoided by many archaeologists, or even deliberately ignored, such as what the significance of Göbekli Tepe is.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we are not taught a more progressive thinking history of humanity in school?
Well, you brought up a very good example, which of Göbekli Tepe. It's another great example of how, in this case, a discovery from within the domain of archaeology should be reshaping history. People that may not have heard of Göbekli Tepe, it's a site in Turkey that was unearthed by Klaus Schmidt, who's unfortunately since passed away, but he was working for the German Archaeological Institute. They discovered this site back in the mid-90s, but it took them quite a while to excavate and document it. And what they found was absolutely astonishing. So they found a huge megalithic site, stone pillars, stone circles, carved figures on them. Some of these monoliths weighing up to 10 to 15 tons, all intricately carved. There are some people that think it may have celestial alignments, and it may actually be a calendar documenting events. That's a whole other topic as that is being uncovered as the investigation moves forward. But what they did find with this site was that it was deliberately buried, something like, I think, 12,000 years ago. So remember that as we know it in the mainstream story, civilization emerged around 6,000 years ago. And now we found a site in Turkey, this massive megalithic sites with dozens of these stone circles with very large single pieces of stone that have been intricately carved, was deliberately buried and dated with the modern carbon-14 radiocarbon dating to be around that age. And that may be the youngest that it is. So if it was buried 12,000 years ago, then it may have existed for thousands of years prior to that. And undoubtedly, it's the product of civilization, right? You require large population bases to create these types of things. You need some people farming to feed the other people. You need specialization in terms of occupation. You need stonemasons. You need organized labor to move the stones. You need cultural systems to kind of set them up and to create them. It's a huge indicator for civilization. It's one that kind of doubles the date. But once again, if you go and look at Göbekli Tepe on a source like Wikipedia, instead of, and this was something that came up on the Joe Rogan Experience when Graham Hancock talked about it, instead of actually saying, yes, this is the product of civilization and this this should move our date of civilization back, what they ultimately did was they changed the definition of hunter gatherers. So instead of admitting and even budging an inch on the dates of civilization, they said, well, no, now this was a site that was clearly created by hunter-gatherers that were kind of bored on the weekend, and they just wanted to get into some stonework because they had all this time on their hands. And it's patently nonsense for anybody who's actually looked at Göbekli Tepe or visited the site. It's quite obviously the result of organized civilization. So, yeah, as to why, I think we talked about it. I think ultimately there's an entrenched dogma in these disciplines, and when you step too, and there's been a few documented examples of this too. When you step too far outside of the bounds of the accepted narrative, your career gets threatened, your livelihood might get threatened. I've actually talked to some of the professionals in this field that kind of agree that there's certainly a lot to investigate here, but it's not something they're willing to do publicly because it means that your career might be over. And there's been a number of examples of that of academics in these institutions that have supported or gone out and investigated and come back with findings that challenge that entrenched dogma of this story of history, that then find themselves shortly out of a job. So, there's a certain amount of, I think, mainstream inertia. And in fact, the very nature of mainstream is to resist change. That's part of it. That happens in any organization. But yeah, I think that's at the root of it. I think there's an entrenched dogma within the existing academic elite that are going to defend that story, no matter what.
I think so as well, but I also think that is beginning to change with new minds joining this conversation, where it'll be easier to talk about. Just like with the UFO phenomenon, it was very difficult at first, but now it's becoming a lot easier. But Ben, we are coming towards the break. We'll be right back.
Gigawatt paranormal powerhouse, KUNX-DB, the X.
This is Micah Hanks of the Micah Hanks program right here on KUNX. And right now, you're having your paradigm shifted by the one and only Cristina Gomez.
Your new source for alternative talk radio on the internet. The X.
Howdy, folks. This is Lou Elizondo, and you are listening to my very good friend Cristina Gomez on Shifting the Paradigm.
Do you have an interest in the paranormal? Then you'll love the UnXNetwork.com. The X is your streaming audio and video for everything supernatural, strange, and mysterious, like UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, and so much more. From hosts like Jimmy Church, Whitley Strieber, Micah Hanks, and Cristina Gomez. Visit the UnXNetwork.com show page for a complete list of all the paranormal programs you'll find on the X. Be sure to follow us on Twitter for updates at KUNXDB. Follow our Facebook group, UnX Network. Find the podcast on Spotify, iHeart, Audible, and Apple Podcast. It's time. It's new. It's the X.
So, you love talk radio? Then you'll love TalkStreamLive.com. TalkStream Live is always on, 24/7, with the best streaming talk shows. Find your favorite talkers and discover some new ones. It's free, readily available online or on mobile with any smartphone or tablet. Finding your favorite talk shows all in one place has gotten a whole lot easier. Just go to TalkStreamLive.com. Be sure to download the free apps from Google Play or the iTunes App Store.
Explaining the unexplained. The new UnXNetwork.com.
Hi. This is Race Hobbs, head of programming at the new UnX Network, and you're locked on Shifting the Paradigm with the intrepid Cristina Gomez on the X.
This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
Welcome back. With me today is Ben Van Kerkwyk from UnchartedX. There's a lot of relics and ruins that look too advanced for the level of sophistication and knowledge of humanity at the time scales they infer. So, in your opinion, how do you think that many of these megalithic structures and buildings were created? And I ask in the sense of them being created with just normal human ingenuity, or could the knowledge have been passed down the ages from a forgotten golden age of humanity, or possibly involved advanced technology given to them from air quotes ancient sky gods?
Yeah, well, there is absolutely evidence that there is a lot of it, that there was some form of advanced technology that was used deep in antiquity. And in fact, it's one of the, particularly we can talk about Egypt's probably the best example, ancient Egypt. But it's one of these kind of not often discussed, but I consider it to be one of the largest contradictions in that in our entire story of history, is that the most advanced work, the best work, the most precise work, the largest work, often the hardest work to accomplish, seems to come from the very earliest periods of that civilization. And in particular, when you look at ancient Egypt, you have what's called the Old Kingdom, which was the first. This is like Dynasty 1 through I think 6 of that civilization. That was then followed by some. There's intermediate periods between these larger periods, but you have the Old Kingdom, then the Middle Kingdom, then the New Kingdom, then the Ptolemaic times, which is essentially the Greek-Roman times. And this civilization stretched from around 3100 BCE to about 30 BCE, ending when Cleopatra committed suicide. She was the last kind of Egyptian ruler. After that, it became entirely Roman. But when you look at things like the pyramids, for example, the pyramids, great example. It's like the biggest and greatest pyramids, and to this day, some of the most advanced and most precisely made structures on the planet were also some of the very first pyramids supposedly ever constructed. We very quickly, that we very quickly came out of antiquity somehow, and the civilization immediately built their most massive, precisely made monuments, and did this massive work in granite. There's a temple. It's called the Valley Temple, that's attached to the Middle Pyramid at Giza, that's made up of these just tremendously huge blocks of granite, some of them weighing up to 70 tons, single pieces. You can't fit a razor blade in between them. They're so precisely shaped and fitted together, made up of hundreds of these massive stones. And all of this, again, dates back to the very earliest parts of the civilization. It's a tremendous contradiction, because that's not how technological evolution works. There is a process. All you have to do is look at our civilization, right? We went from the Stone Age to steam power to space shuttles and striped toothpaste. Like it's not a, it's not, it didn't go the other way around. But when you look at some places like ancient Egypt, when you look at places like South America, particularly like everything that's attributed to the Inca civilization, it's almost as if that it's the other way around. And because we're looking at it through the lens of our mainstream story of history, which says that, well, there wasn't anyone here doing this stuff before them. We know it was the Egyptians that built everything, or in the case of South America, the Inca built everything. But again, those lower layers, those older things that are admittedly from that earliest parts, they are the most advanced, and they kind of declined over time in their capability. I think there's an alternative explanation that matches this evidence much better, and that's one of inheritance. That's one of it's the idea that these civilizations got their start by inheriting objects, architecture, even culture in some cases, particularly with the dynastic Egyptian civilization. They themselves, we call it myth and legend, but they made no such distinction. But they trace their own history back something like 35,000 years. They talk about other periods of time called Zep Tepi, when the gods themselves walk the earth. They're essentially describing beings using high technology and advanced capabilities, followed by what's called the Shemsu Hor, which were the followers of Horus, a whole other period that all existed before the first dynasty ever arose. And they put all that together and they call it their history. But in our day, in today's times, we kind of cut a line through that and say, well, the dynastic part of that's history, but everything before that's just myth and legend. It didn't actually happen. They made it up. I just don't think that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of whether or not it was delivered by sky gods or anything like that, we do know that these cultures, dynastic Egyptians, the Inca, were relatively primitive. Like, so we have tools and techniques that are documented on walls. We have tools in the archaeological record. They used very primitive tools. In the case of the dynastic Egyptians, you're talking about pounding stones, copper tools, flint chisels, relatively primitive tools. They used purely, manpower to get things done. And there are a whole category of artifacts that just simply and provably don't match those tools. They cannot be replicated using those tools. And under close examination, some of those objects and artifacts show evidence for much more advanced tools. So I'm talking about, power saws, lathes. There's some examples. In particular, I just produced a video on the colossal statues of ancient Egypt, and this is just mind blowing to me. It's that there are a number of single piece statues carved from granite, or in some cases even harder material than granite, that weigh more than 1,000 tons. Now, these aren't whole anymore, unfortunately. They've been broken down into pieces and destroyed over time. But we have some pieces of them. In one case, there's a place called the Ramesseum, where essentially the head and shoulders of this tremendous statue that weighed easily 1,000 tons, that's carved out of granite, that is still perfectly polished. Like, it's smooth and polished. And there's just evidence for all sorts of advanced techniques in stonework, not to mention the capability to actually move that material and lift it up and put it into place. We have similar statues there's a place called Tanis, which is in the north of Egypt. Now, there's a granite statue there that would have been probably bigger than that one, the last one, something like maybe 1,200 tons finished, and it was originally quarried more than 700 miles away. So I think more than 1,100 kilometers in the south. So this 1,000+ ton block of granite was extracted from the ground and shipped more than 1,000 kilometers to the north to its final resting place. There's a whole logistical aspect to a lot of that work, and there is no explaining, and there is no explanation really for how this was done using the primitive tools and techniques that we know the ancient Egyptians used. In fact, you really can't do it with the basic techniques that we know they did use to move objects, maybe up to 100 tons, 150 tons maximum. But 1,000 tons is an entirely different story. And there's a lot of engineers that have commented on this. I'd also say there's a number of other aspects, particularly when it comes to the statues, that really point towards some very sophisticated technology being used. And one of those is symmetry. So there's been some analysis done, particularly of these huge heads they're all attributed to Ramses II today, because he wrote his name on them, which is a whole other discussion, because the way that the hieroglyphs are made on these statues is very rough. You can see it being the result of sort of hand tools and chiseling versus the finishing and form of the statues themselves. But there's been some analysis done on a few of these heads, these faces, which are all the same on a lot of the statues that stretch over thousands of years throughout time, which makes it hard to say that they're of any one person. But a couple of these statues, they're perfectly symmetrical, the ones that we've been able to actually analyze. And in terms of you cannot spot the difference. And there's been a few things like reverse transparency overlays, where you take a photograph from the head front on, you make it 50% transparent, and then you flip it horizontally, and then you layer those two photographs over the top of each other, and it's a mirror image. If there was any difference between the left and right sides of these faces, you would see it in that type of an analysis. And it's not there. They are perfectly symmetrical. And this is not a feature of human faces to start with. Like, no human face is perfectly symmetrical. We're all a little bit different left to right of our head. And it's also not an aspect of any sort of traditional artwork. Michelangelo, I've seen the statue of David. Michelangelo did incredible work in marble, but you cannot produce that type of symmetry by hand. And it's not just the faces; it also applies to other sort of almost more complex geometric objects, like the crowns, the head jets that they had. These kind of looks like a bowling pin, but that surface and those shapes are they're compound curved surfaces that are very complex to shape and carve, but these are also perfectly symmetrical left to right. So this is suggestive of some form of almost computer guidance in the way this was shaped. This is not something that can be done by hand and just by eyeballing it. And we see it from statue to statue to statue. So there's this tremendous evidence that something else was going on and there was some more advanced tools and techniques in play. And that whole aspect of the tooling and the precision or the symmetry in these objects gets extended to not only statues, but some of the boxes, these huge single-piece stone boxes. Some of these, 50 to 70 tons with lids weighing up to 30 tons. We see it in columns, all of this single-piece granite work, humongous single pieces of granite that have been quarried and shaped to be perfectly symmetrical, smooth. And we also see it in very small objects. So we see it in the story of the stone vases that, again, come from the very earliest time of ancient Egyptian history. Those in particular are fascinating because they're probably the best example of what I would call a tale of two industries. So this is a theme that I've been working on lately. It's when we look at ancient Egyptian artifacts and stonework, it becomes possible to see that there is a tale of two industries that are going on. When we look at it today, you have to remember that over thousands of years, the dynastic Egyptians used these sites. They built up on them. They constructed their own stonework. They built their own statues. They made their own artifacts. But they did so using primitive tools and techniques. And so when you look at stuff in the past, you can see examples of right next to each other. You can see some incredibly high technology objects using, that are precise, that have tool marks that are unexplainable, right next to stuff that is quite obviously hand carved and hand shaped, even done very well. Like it became a high art form. Like the Egyptians were fantastic at what they did, but what they did was the product of the tools and techniques that we know they used. So you sort of have these examples of a tale of two industries. You have these high technology, sort of out of time, out of place objects right next to objects that were quite obviously created manually and by hand, and that are explainable. And the best example that I like to talk about here is the stone vases. So there, if you go to the Cairo Museum, and I imagine there's going to be a lot more of these in the new Egyptian Museum, which is opening up, and I get to see it this year, which I'm really looking forward to. But they found more than 40,000 of these stone vases. And these little stone vases, they range in size from quite large to tiny, like thumbnail sized. Huge, but they're made from a vast array of extremely hard to work, brittle, very hard stone. And some of it is quite rare, lapis lazuli, like there's schist, there's so many different types of these things, granite, granodiorite, all sorts of different types of stone. But all of them come to us from the very earliest part of Egyptian history. In fact, they really never made any more of these, or never found any more of these after the fourth dynasty. And so after that period of time, the Egyptians would make vases, but they'd make them from alabaster, which is a much softer material. And those alabaster vases weren't perfectly symmetrical. They didn't display the same tool marks. They didn't have the same characteristics as these incredibly difficult to explain stone vases that came before. It's as if that capability just evaporated. But if you look at it through that mainstream story of history, but if you look at it from a perspective of inheritance, it makes a lot more sense. It's like, well, these vases are vastly older. Perhaps if they're vastly older and they were inherited by the kings and rulers of Egypt, and one guy in particular, Sneferu, gathered them all up, like 40,000 plus of them, and had them buried with him beneath his step pyramid. And that's where they all stayed. Like, that's a much more, I think, believable explanation than, they just stopped making them. That craft just disappeared because, it doesn't make any sense. You don't start with the hardest and most difficult form of technology and then decline over time. It goes the other way.
That is very bizarre. And talking about like ancient tools and things like that, to where you said that a lot of the structures in Egypt, a lot of the statues in Egypt are practically symmetrical. And you said that you would pretty much need AI or some type of computer programming to create it so perfect.
Yeah.
In your opinion, how do you think they did it?
This is another good question. It's one I get quite a bit. It's like how was it done? This is a more ephemeral type of answer I have to give here, because if we, and this comes down to kind of the progress of technology, and so we have to look at our own culture, for example, in how this works. So we are undoubtedly a very advanced civilization. We could make these objects if we wanted to. No, and that's our funny thing. Nobody ever has. Like, we've never made like a 70-ton single piece granite box. We've never made a single piece, 1,000-ton granite statue and shipped it. But we could, if we put the resources and time and effort and money in particular into it, we could. We have the capability to do so. So, but in terms of our technological evolution, undoubtedly we're going to know more in 100 years, let alone 1,000 years, right? So we're continually learning, and what you can say from that is that there are domains of technology that we currently don't understand, that fundamentally we just don't understand. So it's very difficult to guess when you look at a lot of this stuff. So if I was to say, how would we do it? Then we would do it with exactly. We would use hydraulics. We would use just giant, basically CNC machines with diamond-tipped saws and blades that are guided by computer systems. So in the same way we shape metal objects, just scale that up like a giant CNC machine, giant vertical lathes, hydraulics and diesel power and machinery to get that stuff out of the quarry and take all the steps it makes to do it, and then huge equipment to then ship that stuff where it needs to go. Now, do I think that's how they were made? I don't think so. There's certainly tool marks on them that suggest that there were power tools and some very advanced like blades and cutting tools being used to shape the material. There's a few isolated examples. I get into them in depth in my videos. But I do think that the explanation for a lot of these advanced objects may lie outside of our current understanding of technology. So, it may lie in those realms of technology and science that we are yet to learn more about. But in 100 or 1,000 years, we may know more about. So it might be things like, resonance or atomic level interaction or, alchemy, or we don't know. So that's my answer on that. Is I don't know how they were done, but what I am sure about is that they were not done, and it's not capable to do them with the primitive tools and techniques that we have in the archaeological record.
So, does the topic of extraterrestrials come up in your research often? And if so, when and which locations specifically?
ET and aliens, it doesn't really come up in my research. That's not to say that I don't think that exists. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there is something going on, particularly in the modern era of disclosure, and we're getting more and more information from governments that they're scratching their heads thinking about it. I'm sure some of it's explainable with the whole black projects and lines of research that are happening in secret parts of the military and whatnot. But that's difficult to explain when you go back to the 80s and times, and times the 60s even before that, where you have similar kind of sightings. Now, but when it comes to ancient civilizations, I think we can explain all of this stuff within the context of advanced human civilizations. I don't think we need to invoke aliens to explain a lot of these objects. And in fact, there's even as perfect and as well manufactured as some of these things are, I think that there is still certain imperfections and certain areas, like the Great Pyramid, for example, being perfectly aligned to true north. It's almost perfectly aligned. In fact, we couldn't even measure the discrepancy in it until something like 150 years ago. But there is a slight discrepancy to where it is in terms of how well it's aligned to true north. And in the same way, these statues are of humans. Like they're representational, and they don't match any particular human face. But when it comes to ancient Egypt, the statues are of humans. Now, that again, it's not to say that there wasn't that. You can't rule out that some of those things were involved, but I think we can explain all of the stuff we see within the context of human civilizations, and certainly the updated timelines on how long humans have been living can support that. So we have been around on this planet for a lot longer than we previously thought we had.
Right, absolutely. And you just touched on the pyramids, and I've read numerous books and listened to several lectures from researchers indicating that inside the pyramids of Giza, within the structure themselves and the geometry, that there are ancient batteries or are themselves, in fact, huge stores of energy. What can you tell us about that?
Well, so there's certainly a popular theory about particularly the Great Pyramid, that it may have been a power plant of some form, that it ultimately generated a form of microwave energy. And the leading proponent of this idea is actually another good friend of mine, and somebody who is responsible for a lot of the the research, the primary research into the technological evidence for a form of ancient lost capability, a guy named Christopher Dunn. And he wrote a book called The Giza Power Plant, and it's a fantastic book. He wrote a couple of books actually, and it does explain pretty much all of the elements and aspects of the Great Pyramid as we know it, and puts it into a framework that could be used to generate this form of microwave energy. And in fact, using his theory, so people may remember a few years ago there was an exploration of one of the shafts in the that go off what's called the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. Now these shafts are only a few inches square, like sort of 4 to 6 inches square, and they run way into they run way through the masonry in the Great Pyramid. Now, there's shafts in the King's Chamber; those exit on the outside, and we know this from earlier times. I think one guy actually rolled a cannonball down one of them, and it popped out in the King's Chamber. But the Queen's Chamber shafts seem to terminate somewhere inside the structure, so they had never been fully explored. You can imagine that, hundreds of feet long. It's very difficult environment to explore with being only a few inches square. So there was an exploration using robots to go up there and look at it and say, well, where does this go and what does it end? Where does it go to? Now, eventually what they found was that the shaft, one of them, the northern shaft in particular, ended in a door that seemed to have some handles, although there were these little copper things on the side of it. So it's just like little limestone plate, essentially at the end of this passage. Now, Chris Dunn, using his theory of how the pyramid may have functioned as a power plant, accurately predicted what they would find behind that door. So eventually they put another robot up there. They equipped it with a drill and a little endoscopic camera and a light, and they drilled a hole through the door. And Chris Dunn said that what they find is a space and then another door or another wall, and that's exactly what they found. He predicted that using his theory. So, I think his theory is very interesting. It's the best. I think it's the best one that explains the potential function for the pyramid. Using our technological perspective, but I would also say that potentially the functional purpose of these structures, and I do believe that they were functional. I don't think they were tombs. There's really almost no evidence that they were actually tombs in the traditional sense. We know what Old Kingdom tombs look like. So we've got lots of examples of them. These aren't Old Kingdom tombs. Some pyramids later on were definitely used as tombs, but not the real big ones, the famous ones. So I think they were functional, but the explanation for them, again, I think may be something that we're yet to fully understand and to find out. And it's only going to take more open-minded research, using all of our scientific expertise to try and crack that open and move it forward. But I think Chris Dunn's got probably the best explanation for it so far. In fact, I know he's actually writing a follow-up to that book. I was helping him out with some photographs, and I talk with him fairly regularly. So I'm very much looking forward to reading that, because there's been some new, as people may know, there's been a bunch of new discoveries made in the Great Pyramid recently. There's something that's happened called the Scan Pyramids Project, which is a good example of what I'm talking about, the type of research we should be doing, which is essentially using cosmic rays to try and detect voids within the structure. So they put in a bunch of muon detectors in the subterranean chamber, in the Queen's Chamber. I've been in that pyramid a couple times over the last couple of years, and I've seen the racks of equipment and the gear they have in there. And they're using cosmic particles over a period of years to basically determine whether or not there are voids and spaces within the structure. And it turns out there are. So there may be as yet undiscovered chambers and passages within that structure. So that work's ongoing at the moment. In fact, Zahi Hawass made some announcement recently that they may have discovered something, but nobody really knows the details of it. So hopefully that'll be shared with the public at some point. But yeah, I know Chris Dunn is writing his follow-up to that power plant book based on a lot of this new information, which he's pretty excited about and thinks that it fits his theory. So yeah, I think my perspective on a lot of these objects, things like some of the ancient sites themselves, Abu Sir, Giza, the pyramids, some of these boxes that we find in underground or in pyramid-like structures, I think they were functional. So I don't think they were all ceremonial. If you take the traditional view with archaeology or Egyptology, the only answer for everything, it's all ceremonial. It's all representational. None of it's functional. But I think there was absolutely a functional purpose for some of it.
This is incredibly fascinating. Ben, we are coming towards another break. Hang tight. We'll be right back.
Your 1 million gigawatt paranormal powerhouse, KUNX DB, the X.
This is Jimmy Church of Fade to Black, and you are in the future because you're listening to Cristina Gomez and Shifting the Paradigm.
I want to thank all of you for listening to The X. But did you know you can watch live streaming video and catch your favorite video casts on the UnX Network YouTube channel?
Wow, you mean I can watch the X shows anytime?
That's right. Watch any show, anytime, even binge watch your favorite programs.
Which shows are on the UnX Network YouTube channel?
You can watch Most Haunted with Dan Terry, Entity Voices, Paranormal Evidence, Paranormally Blonde, and Unexplained Phenomena Australia, and many more. Also, be sure and catch live coverage of special events and special broadcasts from the UnX Network.
That's great. I'm going to subscribe to the UnX Network channel right now.
Awesome. You can find everything you need to know about the YouTube channel at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for everything unexplained. It's the new mainstream. It's the UnX Network.
Explaining the unexplained. The new unxnetwork.com.
Are you ready to read about true paranormal events? UnX Media publishes nonfiction books about UFOs, ghosts and haunted places, time anomalies, cryptid creatures, and more. Just like KUNX DB Radio, it's all about unexplained phenomena. Visit www.unxmedia.com to see our list of great book titles by Debbie Ziegelmeyer, Gene Walker, Devin Listrom, Wayne Lawrence, Bill Spicer, and yours truly, Margie Kay. That's unxmedia.com.
Gold loves chaos, uncertainty, and disarray. History shows us what gold does when people aren't sure about the government, the stock market, their jobs, or their retirement savings. Our national debt is skyrocketing. Gold and other precious metals are a defense measure against inflation and a stock market that might take years to recover. So what can you do right now to protect yourself? Call United Gold Group. We offer gold and other precious metals delivered securely within 72 hours. Are you worried about the stock market? We can also help you set up a real gold or silver IRA or a 401k. Safe and secure. United Gold Group makes gold ownership affordable. Call now and get up to $2,500 in free gold or silver with a qualified IRA. Call 800-753-8534. That's 800-753-8534 or visit unitedgoldgroup.com.
reading about when I get free time, which is so rare these days, is looking at ancient myths, legends, and lore from around the world. And I hear so often that their origins have a seed or a small foundation of truth. Does looking into these types of things help with your research? I mean, what are your thoughts on studying myths?
It's a whole other dimension of what I would consider proof that there was potentially an advanced civilization in the past. It's a very deep area of study. That there's been a number of really well, I won't say awesome books, but very informative books. One in particular called Hamlet's Mill. It's a difficult read, but it's revelatory in terms of what it shows, and it's exactly that. It's this idea that contained within the myths and legends of disparate, disconnected cultures all around the world, from the Chinese to the Vikings to the ancient Egyptians, like different periods of time, different places on the planet. These a lot of these cultures weren't connected. The great traditions of India, for example, they all contain these seeds of knowledge, and in particular, a lot of this comes out in what I would call processional mathematics. So there's a number. In fact, if people are interested in a brief overview of this, I recently did a podcast with Randall Carlson, my third one with him on my channel. I'm lucky enough to interact at a regular basis with Randall. He's amazing, and he talks a lot about this type of stuff. In terms of how this processional mathematics relates back to the measurement of time, space, and sacred geometry. But so we get into that in some detail there. But there is significant evidence that there are things, when I talk about, and what I mean by celestial or processional mathematics, it's the mathematics contained within the long-term cycles of the heavens. So there is, anyone who's looked into this will know that there are these long-term cycles that the earth and the motions of the heavens go through. And I'm not talking about in a year or a day. These are cycles that can last sort of 26,000 years. There's other cycles that last 41,000 years. So you can imagine that they're barely perceptible within a human's lifetime, right? You have to have a fairly advanced astronomical science to even notice them. And some of this does end up getting tied up in astrology in terms of the constellations, which are another consistent thing throughout civilizations, like the origins of the zodiac. It's a whole other interesting story. That's not something that's just contained within one culture, but it's spread across time in many ancient civilizations. But there is a bunch of mathematics that's involved with these precessional cycles. In particular, I'm talking about the precession of the equinox, which is the movement it's the wobbling of the planet. So it's a roughly 26,000 year cycle that is defined by what constellation the sun rises, or what constellation is behind the sunrise on the solstice, and that slowly changes over time to the length of, it's about 1 degree on the horizon every 72 years. So if you hold your thumb up to your at your arm's length and you look at the horizon, that's about 1 degree on the horizon. So over a 72-year period, where that sun rises in terms of the constellational background moves about the width of your thumb. In 72 years, so barely noticeable. But you have the mathematics that express these cycles is contained within myths and legends from cultures all around the world, and in some cases cultures that really had no understanding of this. It's not like it's not spelled out, as saying like, well, the sun moves 1 degree on the horizon every 72 years, but it's these numbers, and the numerology is expressed in tales and myths and legends. It's deified. It's put into character stories. But this mathematics is all there. And Hamlet's Mill, this book, kind of puts that whole picture together. In fact, so it's kind of it's a way of transmitting this knowledge down through time. If you think about how oral traditions work, which is anything prior to the written word, we didn't share stories and legends just by sort of reciting facts. They were stories. They were entertaining. You kind of got sucked in, and there's lore and legend around it. But within that lore and legend from all of these different cultures are contained these seeds of truth, and seeds of a very advanced astronomical science. And because we see this stuff from so many disparate and like spread out in different civilizations and ancient cultures, it's an indicator they all may have had a common origin point. So there may have been an original seeding culture that understood this in significant detail, and then they encoded that into these stories, and they passed that down through time, after the cataclysm. So I do think that any advanced civilization that lived here that we don't know about existed in what we'd call the pre-Diluvian times. And there's a word for it. It's kind of a dirty word in the industry, but we call it like Atlantis might be a term. Like that's one of the legends that may describe a civilization like this, right? And Atlantis sunk. We have that, and there's a strong correspondence to cataclysm in the story of Atlantis, as well as the story of ancient Egypt, for that matter. They talk about an island sinking as part of their origin story as well. But so that culture would have had global knowledge. They would have understood the dimensionality of the planet, of the moon, of the heavens. They understood these cycles. They were global in nature. They had awareness of all these types of things. So it's not just, and you get that expressed in these myths and legends. So to me, it's a huge indicator that there was some sort of original seed culture that then post cataclysm, these tales existed through oral tales, and as people distributed and they survived in different parts of the planet, and over thousands of years, these other civilizations all emerged, and they kept those little seeds of truth in them. And it's only now in our time where people can do the research and write books like Hamlet's Mill that we can start to put that together and piece it together. But it's really interesting, and it actually also exists in the dimensionality of objects like the Great Pyramid, for example. All of this stuff's encoded in architecture as well.
Right. And while we're on this subject, you must have come across numerous references to the Anunnaki in your years of research. What are your thoughts on these ancient godlike entities that were held in such high regard in ancient times?
Well, so the Anunnaki in particular is the Sumerian story. I think it's contained in the Enuma Elish, right? The Sumerian book of creation. So popularized by Zecharia Sitchin. So it's an interesting tale. I'm very familiar with the Anunnaki story, Nibiru, 10th planet. The whole gold mining thing, the crossbreeding of humanity. Well, I guess of the local species with the Anunnaki to create modern humans. So I kind of err on the side of Graham Hancock here with this as well. In that Graham knew Zecharia Sitchin quite well, but unfortunately, it seems pretty clear that Sitchin's been essentially debunked. There's been some deliberate mistranslations in his story of the Anunnaki that really don't line up with the kind of what's written there. And he created the 10th Planet series of books, which I have and are entertaining, but so I don't take the Anunnaki story as some form of literal truth. What is interesting is there does seem to be an interpretation of some of the star maps and I guess some of these little scrolls and I forget what they call them, these things that you roll out and they imprint either paint or into clay a story. There does seem to be again some evidence for advanced knowledge in the times of the ancient Sumer. The Sumerians may have known a bit more about the cosmic environment and the layout of the planets and things like that. In fact, the same holds true for Egypt. There's a good book been written recently called, I think it's but Manu Seyfezada wrote it. He shows some examples of there being existing sets of knowledge in Egypt that also understood the layout of the heavens. What I do find interesting about the Anunnaki story is really shown by the work of the late, unfortunately, Lloyd Pye. It's a Lloydpye. Lloyd Pye, who was he did follow sort of the Anunnaki reasoning, but he did a lot of research looking at some of the genetic indicators that human beings ourselves may have been manufactured or created. But there's a few really interesting sort of anomalies when it comes to humans and our role in evolution and on this planet. There's the whole missing links phenomena gets very much simplified in terms of, well, we're missing one or two species to explain the evolutionary links between us and our ancestors, but it's much more complicated than that. You need almost a dozen different missing links to really explain us. We also have a chromosomal difference relative to all the other mammals and all the other hominids on the planet. And in fact, so Lloyd Pye did some really interesting work looking at at DNA that suggests that we may have actually been genetically engineered, which is actually something that I think is a possibility. So again, this sort of ties in with the whole alien story. I think that there's a strong possibility that we may be the product of what you would call the interventionalism or it's kind of like the Prometheus model. Of like the movie, I think there's a good chance that there was some intervention on this planet at some point that may have something to do with our development. Now, that might have been at the very origin of life itself, because that also represents a massive cosmic enigma. We don't know how DNA just got started in the first place. It's tremendously complex. From the time that we went from single-cell organisms all up to humans today, over millions, if not billions of years, there's been all this evolution, but the one thing that has never changed is the way that evolution is expressed. So if you call DNA a technology, that's been consistent from day one up till now. And DNA itself is tremendously complicated. The idea that there was, some amino acids and proteins puddling around in a soup, and then it got hit by lightning and boom, there's DNA, just doesn't. I mean, it's literally impossible. It doesn't make any sense at all. So we don't know how life itself was started. So it's possible that we were seeded that way through accidental panspermia, which is the process of, say, life existing on another planet that's hit by a cosmic impact, and it ejects a rock out that's got some sort of, DNA and these things on it that eventually lands on Earth, and that seeds life. Or it's possible that humans ourselves may be the result of some form of intervention deep in the past. We could have been genetically engineered. There's a possibility of that. We do know that we are a product of the tree of life of this planet. So, we fit into the genetic picture of the planet. Now, DNA fits into that picture, but that's not to say that it couldn't have been engineered that way, because we also have all these strange genetic deficiencies. We're pretty much the only species that isn't really fit to live on the planet. We can't sit out in the sun without being burned. We need clothes. We can't deal with the climate. Our eyes aren't adjusted well for the light here. You go blind if you look at the sun. There's all these really weird inconsistencies in terms of humans in relation to other life on the planet. Like, we're very weak, and we're the only species that needs to create our own environment in order to survive. If anyone's interested, there's a fantastic lecture from Lloyd Pye called "Everything You Know Is Wrong." It's on the internet. He also wrote a book, which I have here, about that. It's a fascinating story, but he does take you through the whole path with the Anunnaki and how that whole engineering process might have happened. But I'm like, well, I'm not sure about the literal truth of the Anunnaki as laid out by Zecharia Sitchin, but for damn sure, there's some interesting things that have happened in the past.
Yeah, it seems that way. And if we look at the sense of the evolutionary timeline for humanity, it was from cavemen and then snap of the fingers, and then here we are, compared to
Yeah.
all the other animals on planet Earth. It almost just doesn't make sense. Now, a few times you've mentioned Graham Hancock, and you traveled with him to Peru in 2013. One
Indeed.
location of Peru that interests me a lot is the Nazca Lines. Can you share with us your experiences, research, and conclusions in regard to that mystery?
The Nazca Lines. Yeah. So I had the chance. I didn't see them in 2013. I saw them for the first time last year, actually. I went down there with Brian Forrester, and it's actually kind of difficult to get to Nazca. It's a long way out. But you see them, and people don't know what the Nazca Lines are. I think it's the Atacama Desert. I might be wrong, but it's this huge hot plateau, one of the driest places in the world. And then there are these incredible shapes that have been made into these, this arid, dry area. There's a highway that runs right through it. If you look at Nazca Line pictures on the internet, you'll see it. But these shapes are just absolutely massive, very difficult. You can't really make them out from the ground. The best way to observe, they're huge, like hundreds of yards long, in some cases miles long. Like there's straight lines and geometric shapes that are miles and miles in length. And we don't really know where they come from or what their origins are. Some of them are geometric. So there's like long rectangles and triangles and straight lines that just go for miles and are perfectly straight. But in other cases, there's butterflies and hummingbirds and foxes and all sorts of other sort of animals. It's artistic, it's representational, but they're amazing. And the best way you see them is you go out to there's a little airport out there and you get on a flight and they take you over them and you sort of fly over them. Now it's not for the faint of heart, particularly if you suffer any motion sickness as well, because these planes take tight turns, like it's hot and they really bank hard and they pull, so that you get the people on the right hand side see it and then they turn around and they go back the other way and the people on the left hand of the plane can see it. I do intend to make a video about it. I got some good footage of all of these, but it's a real mystery. So some of the species they've looked at that may be represented there actually may be extinct species of animals that went extinct sort of in that 13,000 year, Younger Dryas time frame. So whoever potentially made these figures may have done so far in the past, like a long time ago, and left them there as some sort of indicator. What's more interesting to me are kind of the geometric shapes, like these crazy long lines, and whether, there's been some analysis done in terms of like where those lines stretch out if you follow them kind of around the globe. It's a real mystery. There is a Nazca culture. There was definitely indigenous inhabitants of that region, and they found remains of people that lived there. But there's not really any good indication that they may have been the people who created those things. It's Nazca's, it's fascinating and mysterious. There's been some people say, well, that's a landing strip for an alien spacecraft. I don't think so. I don't think you'd necessarily need a landing strip if you were capable of space flight. But it's a huge mystery. So you have a combination of these geometric shapes, and then these sort of more artistic renderings of other shapes and animals and people. There's an astronaut. There's what looks like an astronaut. There's definitely been some ones done later, and in fact they're finding more. So what they're doing now, and again, this is a good application of modern technology. They're using LiDAR, which is the laser detection and ranging system, to basically go and scan that desert. So even when you can't quite see that there's a pattern there, LiDAR will enable those things to show up. So they're actually uncovering more of these up in that area. And there's been a couple of announcements like that made in the last few years. But yeah, I don't have a lot. I can't explain it. Like the Nazca lines are fascinating. There's just I don't know other than to say that they seem to be the product of a lost people that we don't know who they are or what their purpose was. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of them. But there's definitely some artistic work going on there as well. It's beautiful. It's very much worth visiting. It's worth a long drive out there and the plane flight and everything. So.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Now, I've only had the pleasure of seeing photos, but to be able to see it in person, I think would just be a game changer altogether. And I did an entire show on the mysteries of Peru with Jimmy Church on Mysteries with a History, and that country is so rich with evidence of superior stonemasonry and architecture. So it is. So I'd like to ask, which one specific structure or location that has made you scratch your head the most?
In the whole world or just in Peru?
Just in Peru.
Just in Peru. Well, very difficult to go past Sacsayhuaman when it comes to that. And in fact, Cusco itself. Now, the city of Cusco itself, which was essentially connected to Sacsayhuaman in the past. So Sacsayhuaman is this just massive, what they would call a fortress today, on top of a mountain that's around the town of Cusco. Now, Cusco sits in the Andes. It's at 11,500 feet. It's quite a shock getting off the plane up there. And then in the mountain ranges around it at around 12,000 feet, you have a bunch of different sites, and one of the biggest one is Sacsayhuaman, which is these huge polygonal limestone blocks, and some of these weigh up to, like, I think some of them 170, 200 tons, massive quarried stones that have been shaped up there and put together in these, like almost like a puzzle wall. There's no real not a lot of straight. It's not like linear blocks and things that you might see in Egypt. A lot of these have curved surfaces, and there's terraces and terraces of them. Now, what's interesting is that it goes up over the hill, and then there's remnants of it running down the hill, and it at some point actually connected into Cusco. So I think the whole city of Cusco itself is probably one of the most unique places on the planet. And I love visiting Cusco because it's essentially a megalithic city. It is probably the only place in the world that I can think of that has layers of civilization built up on top of each other that you can see just walking around in the streets. So you have the megalithic civilization, you have the Inca Roca wall, and there's a few streets in Cusco that have these, and some of them made from granite. It's like a scaled down version of Sacsayhuaman with its tremendously large stones. You have a similar version of that in the streets of Cusco, these polygonal walls made of just perfectly fitted and matched and machined together bits of granite and limestone, and like on these walls. And then on top of that, you might have Inca construction. So this is there's a big distinction when you go to Peru. It's so easy to tell. You look at the lower layers, and it's this massive megalithic work that's tightly fitted together. No mortar or anything between them. You can't put a razor blade between the stones. And then on top of that, you find like local stones loosely stacked on top of it with like mud mortar in some places and things like that. That's the work of the Inca. So that came on top of that. Now in Cusco, you then get the colonial Spanish architecture that sits on top of that from when it was all colonized and the Spanish were building it. And then on top of it, you have modern. So you have these like 4 layers in the streets of Cusco that you can clearly see these phases of architecture. Now, I think that original area, Cusco and the Sacred Valley itself, because there's many sites like this spread out through the Sacred Valley. I think it's tremendously ancient. I think there was a lost megalithic age, it may be the same civilization that originally was responsible for all the stuff we were talking about in Egypt, but I think there was a much bigger gap in culture. So I think whatever happened, thousands and thousands of years later, when the Inca finally came into that region, they discovered an abandoned and ruined megalithic city that was Cusco, and that's where they decided to set up their headquarters, like of their civilization, and they began to rebuild parts of it. And you can see all of the evidence for that as you stroll through the streets and you look at these sites. But there doesn't seem to be a strong cultural connection to those builders. Versus in Egypt, ancient Egypt kind of does directly connect to this what we might call a builder civilization in their culture and in their origin story. But the Inca were also much later. So the Inca was, was it 1500s to 1600s? They only existed for around 150 years as a civilization before the Spanish turned up and wiped them all out. But yeah, it's fascinating. So Sacsayhuaman, long answer, I guess. Sacsayhuaman's probably up there. The streets of Cusco, and then Alante Tambo is my other favorite site there, just because it's like a microcosm of everything you can see in the Sacred Valley. And that's the place where you see that there's 3 distinct forms of stonework that you can observe in South America, and they're all just very well displayed at Alante Tambo.
Wow. I wish I had a longer format show because I have so many more questions for you, Ben, but we are out of time. I want to say thank you so much for being on Shifting the Paradigm. Where can people find you online to stay up to date with your research and your efforts?
Christina, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, and if people are looking for more, you can find everything I publish. It's all up on my website, UnchartedX.com, or just go to YouTube. It's youtube.com/c/UnchartedX for my channel. And if you go on my website, I am on all the social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. All of those links are on my website, and you can follow me over there. I publish pretty much everything I do on those platforms as well.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to the UnX Network, KUNX-DB, Kansas City, Missouri.
Ben opened my mind to a lot of questions that I had, and he answered a good amount of them. So I definitely look forward to having him on again in the future. All of his social media links are below in the description box. Check out my website at strangeparadigms.com to catch all of this show archives in podcast and video format, along with guest appearances and all of my social media links, such as Discord, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and more. Follow me on Twitter at eyes_on-the-skies to catch all of my updates and news. I want to wish you all a wonderful week. Please like this video or podcast on your platform of choice and share it with those who have the same interest. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's a lot more great shows coming to you soon. Be safe, and remember, keep your eyes on the skies.